Good luck, everyone.
Okay, it's 2:30, so we're going to get started. I want to welcome you to this session, which is called Media Analyses for Understanding Host Communities. This is a session that's being presented by a large team. I'm going to briefly provide biographies of the entire team, and then two of the team members will present. So just very briefly, we have Erika Frydenlund, who is a research assistant professor at the Virginia Modeling Analysis and Simulation Center, or VMASC, at Old Dominion University. Her research takes place in the Story Modelers Lab, and she works to build simulations that explore political and social dynamics that contribute to protracted refugee situations where refugees remain displaced for more than 5 years. Jose Padilla is also a research associate professor at VMASC at Old Dominion University. His primary research focuses on advancing computational modeling methods towards increasing modeling accessibility across ages and across disciplines. Katherine Palacio is an assistant professor at the Industrial Engineering Department at Universidad del Norte, located at Barranquilla, Colombia, where she teaches data analysis and knowledge management. Her primary research interest is healthcare knowledge management and forced migration. Joseph Martínez is an undergraduate research assistant in the Industrial Engineering program at Universidad del Norte, Barranquilla, Colombia. Joseph is interested in the application of computational methods and machine learning models in industrial contexts and forced migration. Lydia is a doctoral student in the graduate program in international studies at Old Dominion University and holds a master's of public health. She's interested in studying the intersections of health, migration, and absorptive capacity and their relationship with the epidemiological, political, and social inequities in crisis settings. And finally, Madison Gonzalez, who just defended her MA in International Studies on Monday and is a graduate research assistant on the Story Modelers team at VMASC at Old Dominion University. Her research more specifically focuses on South Africa to understand how access to water security shapes instances of social conflict. We're going to start with Madison, I believe, and she will be speaking for approximately 20 minutes, and you will hear a small gong when she has 5 minutes left, which is the method that we're using for timing. If you have any questions, please either type them in the chat or save them until the end. We should have about 30 minutes at the end for questions. So if you are ready, Madison.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself now. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. So I have been working on a team at the Virginia Modeling Analysis and Simulation Center at ODU in Norfolk, where we have been using a newspaper analysis to understand refugee host fatigue in Lesbos, Greece. So I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of our introduction, literature review, our methodology process, and then analysis of all of our findings and future research as we go along with our work. So in 2015, Lesbos, Greece became an epicenter for the European migration crisis. During this time, a lack of support from the government and the EU has caused frustration from the local population towards migrants. We show through our newspaper analysis how frustrations are precipitated by how the situation has been handled by various actors at various levels. We focus on the perspective of the host population to act as an indicator of social absorptive capacity for communities receiving refugees and migrants. I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of the media analysis. So the media has been accepted as a reliable source to understand anti-immigrant sentiments, as scholars have found that media does shape individual perspectives. They find that it is a contextual factor that influences different perceptions regarding different events and situations. the media content specifically and the news coverage in particular matter. So scholars such as Vergeer have used the cultivation theory, where he argues that exposure to media shapes how the individual sees the world. So in this, he argued that a fixation on immigration issues in the media has led to individuals seeing immigration as a problem that should be solved. Other scholars see that there are two views of competitive threat from the individual and group level. From the individual level, they see that there is a social and economic competition, whereas on the group level, they find that there is a cultural threat to their well-being. Other scholars have found that media salience has led to the rise of extreme right groups and anti-immigrant sentiments. This has come from, again, a focus on the negative components of immigration, such as an increase in crime events, and also the fact that political groups claim issues. So with this, they have found that extreme right groups claim the issue of immigration. With this, individuals think that these extremist right groups will solve the issue of immigration and then find more support for these groups because of an increased negative coverage of immigration issues. Furthermore, other scholars find that the media controls how individuals perceive different situations through their ability to gatekeep information, their framing, and agenda setting. Everything that happens in the world does not necessarily get covered in the news. And because of this, reporters have a large ability to shape what individuals see and how they see these situations.
Are you going for a walk? Yeah. I'll come with you.
So our methodological process began by us selecting a reliable data source, which for us was the Democratis local newspaper. So we selected this newspaper by consulting with in-country experts who made us aware of potential biases that this newspaper would have. We then created a search query that we adapted to collect newspaper articles within our data set that we then translated from Greek to English. So we understand that some meaning is lost in translation, but because of this, we have focused on events that precipitate frustration. We then spot checked our results and revised these results and then began downloading all of the articles as PDFs. After this, as a team of coders, we created and established a codebook to capture local frustrations toward external actors such as the government, geopolitics, migrants, other locals in society, and infrastructural capacity. We did this throughout a series of various meetings to establish our codebook, and we continuously updated this codebook with new definitions as we moved through our coding process. We then chronologically coded all of the articles to understand how events evolved by using the in vivo content analysis software. Upon completion of coding each year, we ran yearly comparison queries to compare the two coders' results. So through these comparison queries, we had a kappa coefficient of 0.62, which comparing to other qualitative studies, this has been deemed a sufficient measure for intercoder reliability. Then separately and individually, our two coders thematically grouped their coding results. This acted as another method of intercoder reliability, where each coder separately created eras to understand how frustration evolved throughout the coding. Once these eras were generated and the two coders agreed on these eras, we again checked with an in-country expert to see if this reflected how he perceived events to evolve throughout the migration situation. The graphs you see on the screen are example from one of our coders of the parent nodes to understand how frustration evolved throughout time on Lesbos, Greece. So on this chart, you will see frustration towards geopolitics, other locals, towards migrants, the government, and the use of infrastructure. So again, this graph just goes to show how frustrations evolve over time and showing where these major peaks in frustration occur throughout the migration situation. I would now like to provide you with an overview of the eras that our two coders created. So we found that at the beginning of the migration situation from 2014 to March 2015, that locals experienced an innocence period where they expressed empathy towards migrants and a moral obligation to address the situation at hand. Following this, there was a shock period following the major migration influx that overwhelmed citizens and the infrastructural capacity on the island. Then there was a period of optimism that followed the EU-Turkey deal, where the island slowly became decongested and locals saw that there was potential for normalization on the island. This was followed by an era of fear and fire, where recurrent fires and refugee camps threatened local livelihoods. After this, there was an era of criminality, where we observed an increase in reporting on criminal events at the hands of migrants. This was followed by an era of securitization of migration, where the government implemented stricter border controls and brooming operations. After this, there was an era of policy fallout, where we saw that the securitization in the previous era proved to be futile, as there was again another increase in migration arrivals. Finally, we observed an era of reparations, where locals demanded economic compensation for the negative impacts that they have faced due to the migration situation. Through the rest of the following slides, you will see on the screen quotes that are direct excerpts from the newspaper articles that we analyzed. So in the era of innocence, we observed empathy from locals and a moral obligation to address the migration situation. Frustrations were primarily directed toward traffickers and smugglers for the unnecessary deaths at the sea to migrants and children. Through this, there was also frustration towards other locals for their support of extreme rightist groups. So through this, we saw frustration for the negative situation that was happening to the migrants, but also a rift happening in society because of uncommon support for extreme rightist groups. Following this, we identified the shock era, which was followed by a migration influx that overwhelmed the local capacity to maintain the situation. Looking at the first quote on the screen, the article explains that there were more than 6,000 refugees that had arrived on the island in the past 24 hours. This was something that the government and the island infrastructure was not able to keep up with. Locals expressed a sense of abandonment from the EU, as they understood that the EU was not doing their part to keep up with the migration situation, and felt that Greece was being left on its own to deal with the issue. Furthermore, there were concerns over government failure to deal with the issue, as locals observed that there was not enough cooperation happening at the different levels of government. Finally, in early 2016, the EU-Turkey deal happened, which led to a sense of optimism on the island. Following this deal, the island slowly began to decongest. So looking to the second quote on the screen, we can see the excitement coming from locals, where they explain, finally, the beach next to the municipal beach that had been turned into an informal settlement of illegal immigrants for months was evacuated after the intervention yesterday. However, we saw that this was a very short-lived period of optimism, as eventually Lesbos would become a hotspot for the migration situation. In the next era, we marked a turning point in local frustration, whereas beforehand, frustration was directed toward external actors such as the government, other locals, or the EU. We found that during this period, local frustrations began to be directed at migrants themselves. This was because migrant actions began to directly negatively impact locals because of the various fires that occurred within the refugee camps. Locals expressed concerns that the fires would eventually spread to their local communities. Fires did eventually spread to this point where they harmed olive groves, hurting the locals' income, and also posed a safety threat to their homes and to their children. Following the fear and fire era, we saw that there was increased reporting on criminal activity by migrants. Frustration at this point was about crime from migrants, but also toward the government for their failure to address the situation, which locals saw led to an increase in crime. At this point, we observed locals beginning to take matters into their own hands. For example, one farmer who had continuously found migrants on his property taking his animals, he shot into the air to scare migrants away and was then arrested. This was just one example of how locals began to take matters into their own hands. At this point, we saw that there was intolerance toward migrants due to the various disturbances that they were causing to local communities, both from fires and criminal activities. Because of this, locals became very intolerant of having migrants housed anywhere near their local communities due to fear of what may happen if they lived near their homes. Following this, we identified an era of securitization of migration. This followed when New Democracy came to power and began implementing stricter policies for border control and also implementing brooming operations, which involved more police operations to deal with smuggling, stealing, and other criminal acts. During this point, we also observed that there was a decline in arrival numbers due to stricter border control policies. However, despite the seemingly positive turn in events, we also observed that there was less patience for migrant presence within the Greek community. While in the previous era, there seemed to be a positive turn in events, we saw that this was very short-lived, identifying an era of policy fallout. During this period, we observed that policies in the previous era were very short-lived, as there was another increase in arrival numbers that again overwhelmed the local population. Locals accused the government of not doing enough in terms of governance of infrastructure, policymaking, as they observed human catastrophe on the island. Frustrations at this point tended to be directed toward the government for their policy, because they saw that the policies from the previous era did not improve their situation on the island. Also, locals began to witness catastrophe firsthand due to policy fallout. The era ended with the devastating fire in the Moria camp that completely burnt the camp to the ground. Locals argued that the fire happened because of the government's mismanagement of the situation and the fact that they ignored the poor living situations that migrants were living in, thus leading to this devastating fire. This then leads into our final era of reparations. The fire destroyed Moria completely, causing the government to need to find a new location for housing for migrants and refugees. Through this, we saw that government failure led to extreme events such as the Moria fire, and then led to increased negative sentiments toward migrants. Locals at this point reached their breaking point where they became completely intolerant of migrants on the island. Locals even began to build barricades or human barricades on roads to block government officials who were trying to move into areas to create temporary tents for migrants. At this point, locals began to demand economic compensation for the various negative impacts that they felt over the past 5 years due to migration. They demanded compensation for the negative impact that migrants had on tourism, that they had on crime from stealing from businesses and local households, and also the negative impact that they perceived migrants had on the economy. So through our era's creation, we found that these eras represent a shift in host population frustration, as frustrations peak and change throughout these eras. We furthermore identified that these frustrations developed from continuous government failures to address the population's needs. We further find that this complements the cultivation theory, as negative media reporting over time marked a turning point in the frustrations that began to express directly towards migrants, whereas at the beginning, locals had a sense of empathy to address the migrant situation. I don't know if we're doing questions directly afterwards or waiting for the next presentation, but I and my team members look forward to answering any questions that there may be.
Thank you. I think we'd agreed that we would go to the next presentation, which will be Joseph, and that we will hold the questions until the end. But again, if people do have questions, they can post them in the chat if they want to hold on to them until later, or we'll have them verbally at the end. So Joseph, whenever you are ready.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me and also see my screen?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can.
Okay. Hello everyone, and thanks again for coming to this presentation today. And I'm Joseph Martínez, and I am going to present about what are the Colombians say about the Venezuelan migration situation in the country. And so as a brief introduction, this research is a part of a bigger project that is performed by the study models team in the Old Dominion University and VMASC. And the team supporting this research is Jose Padilla and Erika Frydenlund, both from Old Dominion University, and both were previously mentioned at the beginning of this session. Also, as supporting this team, there was a consultant team in Colombia. So for this part, we have the Katherine Palacio and also supporting the team. Okay, the content that I will present in this presentation is first, I will introduce you to give a general context about first the global project that is performed, but also the context about the Venezuelan migration, and finally a literature review about the internet and social media and its role in this context. The second part will be the methodology, which is divided in two: the data extraction and collection, and the second one is the data analysis. And then the results and the conclusions, and finally we'll have the questions section. So first of all, about the global project that is called Computational Framework for Absorptive Capacity. This is a multinational project financed by the U.S. Office of Naval Research, and it has study cases in Greece, Colombia, and South Africa because of the recent migrations that have been happening in these countries. Also, this project aims to understand how a country absorbs a massive fluid of migrants. Absorb is like a synonym of receiving. And we are interested on what are the locals and the government and internationals and local organizations are doing and saying. And in this particular case, we will focus on what are saying the locals, which are the Colombians, about this migration and also the migrants. Then, as a geographically context, this here is located Colombia and Venezuela. And in this migration started in 2015, and it started to increase in 2017. There were the people from Venezuela started to come to Colombia due to the political issues from that country. The metric says that around 1.8 million migrants are here in Colombia today, and it started to increase since 2018. These are the graph of the number of migrants that is currently in Colombia, and we see here the evolution of this number through the years. And also, as these people come into Colombia, they start to talk, they start to have opinions about this migration and these people, and they talk to each other, but also they tend to express their opinions in some context. That's why we used a approach that is using social network to analyze these feelings and these opinions of the people in Colombia. So first, as a brief additional context about these opinions that were generated, we have these two surveys. The survey in the left side shows how the opinion is present in the Colombians. So in this survey, some questions were asked to some households in Colombia, like if they think that the migration is good for the country, and the majority said no, but also if they think that this migration, and they have a favorable opinion about these migrants. Most of them said yes. Also, they asked them about if they think that these migrants affect the opportunities on the jobs and also the health services. And we found that mostly they disagree with this idea, but in the healthcare size, this is around 50-50. And the left side is a survey that was done to the migrants. So in this one, we have like the conditions, the food or household conditions that they have when they come to Colombia. And we notice that most of them have severe insecurity talking about the food. And this is because they come to Colombia with low resources, economic resources, and this make worse their income into the country. So why are we using social media to analyze these opinions? And it's because the literature supports that one of the potential determinants of hate crimes and also the attitudes toward the migrants is the use of social media and also the internet. And also this use of the internet, it's these social networks are designed to express their opinions, but also in there the people can express that opinions with hate speech, that is this kind of language that is hostile or dangerous towards a person or a group of people according to one specific characteristic. And for example, in this case in Colombia, is about the nationality of these incoming people in Colombia. We also found an additional definition that is helpful, that is the frustration. So this frustration is defined as when the people, their expectations don't agree with the reality. So when the immigrants come to Colombia, they have expectations of what they will find here. And also the Colombians have expectations of what that can bring to the country. And if the reality doesn't match these expectations, there is a frustration that is created in this process. So the methodology used was from the public Twitter API. We found these tweets and filtered according to they match our situation. So first we filtered by the location that they were tweet from Colombia, and also that they match amount of keywords that help us to filter them that we know that they are from about the Venezuelan migration. Here to the left, we found this query that was used. And also we filtered in these specific periods of time that we were using, that is 2015 to 2021. And the total amount of extracted tweets was 4.5 thousand tweets. Also, from these tweets, there were a specific information that was extracted, the name and the username of the people that tweeted, the text, and also some metrics like the likes, retweets, or comments. But also these connections that are created between them. So for example, if a people is one person retweets another person, there is a connection created between them, and we added to the data set to not lost, and then use it later. In this cleaning, we manually cleaned it according to the text that we know that this text, this tweet was 100% talking about the migration. This pre-processing was different in the different methods that we use. Later, I will explain them because there is a whole big method, but they is divided in some smaller ones, and the pre-processing depended on what do we need for each of them individually. So as a big picture of these methods, with this complete data set, we first perform a social network analysis that provide us a general idea of the data and exploratory view of them. And then we analyze the text of these tweets using sentiment analysis and a xenophobia identification. In this second method, we use two approaches, a lexicon-based approach and a manual labeling approach. Okay, in this first approach, in this first method, sorry, the social network analysis, the intention of this methodology is to capture a conversation in a way that is that can be represented graphically in a network view, but also with quantified with some metrics. In this example, we have two different graphics from a specific years of the dataset. So for example, in 2015, we have the graph of the conversation is in this year. Any of the elements that represent are in the conversation is listed here as a dot. So for example, it can be either a tweet, a user, or as media is also created like YouTube videos or images, that is also included here in the graph, but also these connections between them. So connections between the users, connections between different elements, and then as this is marked in a time frame, we can have different views according to the year. So as the time pass by, more elements are more people, more tweets, more media, but also more connections, and the conversation and the whole view is growing. So with this methodology, we can measure how important is a specific element in one specific year, but also how this importance of these elements evolve through the time. In this second methodology, that is the sentiment analysis and xenophobia identification, we can split it into two major functions. The first one is to, from a specific tweet, we measure how positive or negative is this tweet according to a tone. So the more negative represent that the tweet is more negative, and the more in the positive side represents the opposite. So in this first approach, that is the lexicon based, the whole sentence, the whole text of the tweet was divided word by word, and any of them individually was assigned a specific tone number. And this number was in this lexicon, that is a dictionary that relates or links a specific word with assigned a specific tone. And the second function of this methodology is to identify if a tweet is xenophobic or is not xenophobic. And it uses also this lexicon of pejorative words that are used toward the migrants. So if they found a word in this tweet, and it classified it as xenophobic. The second approach is the manual labeling, and in this case, we manually analyze any of them individually, or any of the tweets, and assign them or categorize them according to some variables. So for example, we use the tone variable to measure how negative or positive was a tweet, and it was performed by a researcher. Also, this process was validated because it was performed by two different researchers to have an unbiased result, and the agreement between those two researchers was around 85%, which means it was a good process. Also, these here were labeled more than 3,000 tweets in this specific approach. So with this, we have results for these two different parts of the methods. In this part, the first one is the social network. With this, we found the 20 more important accounts that according to different metrics. But as taking in consideration the confidentiality, we cannot show these names of the people. So as the summary, I listed here as categories of accounts. So I divided into these 6 categories that are politicians, so are or media, NGOs, civil persons that are the people of the common people or ordinary people, the government entities like the ministries, and the sports accounts, because we found that it were also mentioned accounts from athletes or from clubs, so it was listed here. According to this first metric, we found that the majority or the politicians were always here in the degree, and this metrics refers to how mentioned or how related was these people in general. So the more in degree value means that the people was more important in terms that they were more mentioned, and this shows that the media, the politicians, and the government entities were the most mentioned in these years. Also, as this second metric, that is the total opposite. How much does this account mention or comment other people? And we found that the first 3 years, it was mainly driven by the common people, by the civil persons. But starting 2018, which were the presidential elections here in Colombia, we found that the politicians and also the government entities started to have a space in this conversation, commenting about other people. And this finally, in these third metric, we found the between centrality, which is about these people that act as like a bridge between the information of the whole network. And we found here that mostly in the first years, the civil persons take the majority importance, but also starting in 2017, the government entities and the politicians started to gain a space here. The next result is about the sentiment analysis and the xenophobia identification. In this first approach, that was the lexicon one, we found in the left side the result on the tone of the tweets. So this is the main tone of the whole tweets in specific months, but also in the specific years. And with this, we found that as the time passed by, the mean tone of the tweets is becoming more positive. But we have that in 2018, this tone is, decreased a little bit, and it may be related with the migration flows that I presented in the beginning, which in which we noticed that in 2018, the number of Venezuelans, the proportion or this increment of people coming to Colombia was more higher. In this right side, we found the second function, that was the proportion of hate speech tweets. So here we measured which percentage of the whole tweets in a specific month or year were classified as xenophobic or non-xenophobic. In this case, it was divided in the totality, but also in women and men. And this is because in Colombia, we have genders in the words. So with that genders, we can identify when the people were talking with hate speech toward the women or toward the men. And we use that to divide that metric into a gender based. And we found that mostly the men, the hate speech is more about the men instead of the women. But as a general conclusion, we found that this hate speech proportion is decreasing over the time, and this decreasing is mostly related to the decreasing also in the hate speech toward the men. And the next one is the results from the manual labeling approach. And we found here in the upside is the tone distribution of these tweets. So as previously we used the mean tone, but this time we use it separately as the distribution. And we found that considering this scale, considering the negative tone, the negative side as the xenophobic or negative tweets, this zero as a neutral tweet or an informative tweet, and the positive side as a support tweet toward the migration or toward the migrants. And we found that this negative side were mostly counted around 50%, but the highly negative tweets were more present in the 2015, the start of the migration, but also in 2018. Also in 2018, we found that it was a larger amount of support tweets, and this was because in this year, the proportion of migrants coming to Colombia was higher than the previous years. Also, in this manual approach, we could identify, or we could classify about who were the people talking about. And we found that the people mostly talk about the migrants as the person, and they don't often use or to talk about the migration situation in general. Also, they tend to talk about the government and the geopolitics, which means the other governments from the continent from South America. And these proportions were mostly the same instead of 2018, in which we found that the government side was higher, as I previously mentioned about because of the presidential elections. And as an additional result of this methodology, we built a timeline with some important events that played a huge role in this tone, driving the tone negatively or positively. And we found first that a highly used, for example, of the word Beneco, which is a pejorative term used to refer to the Venezuelan migrants. Also, we find that the government and sport-based events played a huge role in drawing the tone. So the statements of the politicians and also the actions that the politicians do and the athletes and sport players had a huge impact in this conversation. In this right side, we see that as we noticed, one of the variables were who were the people talking about, and we analyzed them individually. We found that the people were talking also about themselves, about the locals, and when they talk about themselves, that was very negative. Also, when they talk about the government, there was no positive side until 2018. I think it's also related to the elections. Additionally, when they tend to talk more about the migrants instead of the migration. About the migration, they tend to talk about more in a neutral tone, which means they tend to inform or not to give opinions about that. And also, as the supporting opinions or the positive side of these tweets were mostly related to people around the people with the idea that the migrations create opportunities for Colombia. So these are the conclusions and lessons that were learned in this project. So first is the positivity or beneficial of the identifications of these stakeholders in the conversation. With this, we can identify the important people that have a huge role in this conversation, but also a huge impact on what the people think or what the people comment. The second one is that this methodology is useful in terms of we can measure the frustration, which is more, we pass that from an abstract definition to a quantified variable. The next one is that in general, we notice that the Colombians or the locals they talk about the migrants in a medium of high level of negativeness. Next, these events, there is events that significantly impact the use tone in this conversation, but also important people, as I mentioned in the first part. And also, we found the valuability of this analysis in a time frame, because we found, that these conclusions were depending on which year we analyzing. So depending on what's happening in this year, in that specific year, we found different results. And this methodology that has a highly capability of being extended to other contexts. And that is part of what's next in this project. First increasing the sample size and implement robust and complex methods to these methodologies, we will have more. We will have better results and also more reliable ones. And the second part is extend this analysis to other countries and other contexts, knowing that the migration situations are around the world, and we can apply this methodology to support other studies on other situations in different countries, not only in Colombia and the Venezuelan migration. These were the reference used in the project and also in the slides. It's the that's all for today for this presentation. And now we can have our question sections, questions or comments. And if anyone have a question or a comment, we are happy to hear you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I wonder if you could stop your screen share.
Sure.
Perfect. So that we can see everybody. And if you have a question and you'd like to ask a question, if you can use the raise hand function, it's in your reactions section. And we're a small enough group, actually, you can also probably just shout out. So do we have any questions for either Madison or Joseph? I know that I have a question, and perhaps if it's okay, I will take advantage of this moment of silence to ask that question. You're part of a collective team, and you've chosen a different methodology in each site. And so I wonder if the speakers or even a larger part of the team can talk about why you chose this particular method for this particular site. If you intend to switch methodologies between sites. And I think also to the speakers, what you see as the benefits of using the other speaker's methodology, what else that might have brought to your own project. So sort of 3 related questions around the choice of different methodologies.
I can speak to the newspaper analysis, and my other team members are here, so if I miss anything, please feel free to chime in. But so I only presented on the newspaper analysis in Greece, just because this is a journal article that we kind of have in the works and wanted to get a little bit of early feedback if we could. But this is also something that we did in tandem with having another coder in Colombia, coding the newspapers in Colombia as well. So when we established the code book that I talked about for the newspaper analysis, that was through a series of meetings from coders in Greece and in Colombia for us to kind of identify, these are the commonalities between our 2 different migration situations. This is how we can better adapt it to fit both countries. So that was definitely a cross-contextual, I don't know the word. It was a cross-contextual effort from both teams working in 2 different countries. I do think that Joseph's Twitter analysis could be potentially more helpful, because I think in the newspapers, there is less of a voice for migrants and displaced populations. And I think there's potentially more of a chance to hear their voice through internet and, you know, social media and things like that, if they have access to the internet. So that would be my take on that. I don't know if my team members have something else to add.
Also, more than switching methodologies, we think that combine them in the future is the objective, that we use different methodologies, and we found the better side of each one and try to have a better methodology in the future. So that's but the parts and the benefits of having different methodologies is because every methodology is like has a specific purpose and for a specific problem, and these different approaches have the benefits because we combine the pros of these two different methodologies.
If I could just add to that too, one of the problems that we found with the social media is that the same types of platforms are not as popular in different locations. And so in Greece, probably besides the fact that the character set is very different, the language capacity of these automated analyses are different. Greeks tend not to use Twitter in country quite as much, and so the representation is very small. And I think in South Africa, you'll probably find that the representation of social media users is probably reflective also of a large socioeconomic divide, like an insurmountable one. Of course, that's always a limitation of social media, like age and socioeconomics, but Colombia, it seemed to be a little bit more ubiquitous. And Joseph really was prototyping some of these methodologies that we'll try to extend later. So he was really leading that particular effort.
Can I ask you to continue on that line of thinking? Because I was also thinking about multiple discourses and the fact that newspapers represent the voices of a certain segment. And when we started talking about social media, I thought, oh, great, because social media tends to have, we know that with social media, information is being flowed to you based on an algorithm that's connected to your previous interests. So the news that we get through Facebook, for example, is going to be determined by the kind of news that we look at. The feeds that we get in Twitter will be determined by who we're already following. So the network piece is really interesting. The newspapers, I think there's selectivity that goes into the newspaper as well. So I was thinking with these two different methods about the bias that exists within the streams. We know that people with stronger negative attitudes post more frequently, for example. So there's increased frequency of negative posts on social media because small numbers of people post frequently. Newspapers control that, but then they're much more an editor, a voice, a population. So can you talk me through some of the ways you thought about bias and multiple discourses within the different media?
So for the newspaper in Greece, I don't think I mentioned this, but we also included a lot of articles that were from a local editorial called the Wrong and Upside Down articles. And while that does have its own extreme biases, I think it was useful in our context because we're trying to understand host frustration. So through those articles, we could get the voice directly from the local of how they felt about a particular situation. So those would be the more kind of extreme and biased articles that we would look at, but those were also the ones that really gave us an understanding of how people on the ground were feeling about migrants and the government and things like that, that made their situation worse.
I think for Democritus too, the newspaper we were using in Greece, we consulted people who live in Lesbos about the newspapers that are most widely accepted, and some of them aren't even published online because it's a pretty like old school Greek community. A lot of their news is really spread by word of mouth, which is why we also wouldn't be able to catch them on Twitter. So, I mean, I think all of these media sources are problematic in their own ways, right? Like the newspaper is this curated source, and Madison, who just finished her thesis, one of her committee members commented, because she used to be a reporter, that you really should pay attention to who's writing the articles too, because that person who's assigned to that beat can have their own leaning. And if they're the only person who goes out to do that kind of story, like somebody who always tends to cover migration or somebody who always tends to cover protest, you're going to end up with their bias because they've curated that source. But then, like you said, I mean, even in social media, we're essentially looking at a curation that's done in terms of age and accessibility to the internet and country coverage. And not to mention, I think Joseph mentioned this, but we limited the tweets using geotags, and not very many tweets are actually geotagged. So you're already selecting a very small subset of people who are willing to disclose their location, because we needed to know that the voices were coming out of Colombia and not about Colombia from other places. And so, I mean, I think all of them have their specific sort of leanings, but in some sense, you know, you look at newspapers and you're getting sort of a more traditional curated voice, but you've got social media where you have people who are influencers who may have no power in real life. And through some triangulation of this and other quantitative data about what's happening in country, besides, we're also, as part of this project, doing interviews with stakeholders in these countries to sort of triangulate this. I think it's all part of a picture, and we just have to be really careful to be conscious of the types of biases that each of them introduce. So Madison was careful about choosing her words that, you know, it was increased reporting about crime. It's not increased crime, it's increased representation of crime in media, which we can't exactly measure. That we have surveys deployed to these areas, but can't exactly measure how people felt about seeing more crime. We just know that more crime was being reported. And so, you know, trying to be careful and balance that, but otherwise we have no representation of host community voices in this type of research. And so we've been experimenting with some of these different angles and trying to see what we can come up with as a big picture. I don't know if that answers your question. I probably just rambled for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, that question was a rambling question. No, it's interesting because, you know, we have this illusion that if we ask surveys that we somehow now get an accurate representation of people's voices. And of course, what we get is we get the answers of people who answer surveys who are asking the questions we thought to ask in the way that they want to present themselves or think that we want to hear their answers. So yeah, so it's always just interesting to think about what is the nature of the bias within this particular methodology, and it's just interesting to think it through, because I think sometimes we're unaware of how those biases play out in newspapers, or like the point about a particular journalist having a particular lens, I think is really relevant. In Toronto, we have a particular journalist on the more left-wing newspaper who covers the immigration. So all the articles on immigration and refugees, the majority of them actually end up coming through, in that newspaper, come through this one person. It's a really good point that I hadn't thought about.
Jose's going to talk, but he's off camera.
I'm off camera.
You want to put your hand out like a hand puppet?
Ta-da.
I think that 2 comments on that. One, the idea ultimately was to conduct an exploratory analysis, just to be able to have an idea of what the dynamics were. So we didn't want to start with any preconceived notion, and allow this work to facilitate the construction of other methods, again, that complement what we have done so far. So the idea is that in the near future, we should be deploying surveys that have been verified by the Colombian team, at least start with the Colombian team, in order to be able to have a better idea to complement what we're doing. In terms of biases, and I think that one of the advantages, I think that in terms of comparing the 2 contexts, is that some initial findings were identifying some curiosities, for lack of a better word, in order that we still need to verify, we still need to double check. So for instance, the 2017, 2018 timeframe, the same code increase in the number of codings for the 2 teams that were working separately. There was a noticeable increase on the frustration towards migrants in the 2017, 2018. So what I'm trying to say with that is that one may just be an interesting finding, but secondly, that allows to double check in terms of, well, how biased might the media be, but at that moment, even can we go through the bias and being able to identify something meaningful that is comparable among the 2 contexts. So far, we still haven't been able to go through and establish if this is different, some fluke or not, but it was fairly interesting, to say the least, that we're able to say, well, the number of incidents reported in both cases have increased in that 2-3 year time frame. So that may tell us something in terms for implications, or at least to suggest ideas of how situation needs to be treated and considering time frame. But again, the idea is that one helps the other in terms of, well, we may not be, while we may be biased, this type of comparative analysis maybe help us get through the bias and see that there is something that is of more value. And I think that I have another one. Oh, the third, I said two, but I have a third bit, is that in the Colombian context, it's a very interesting context, by the way, because there has been a concerted effort by both the media and the government to be careful on how migrants are portrayed. So there has been a conscious effort by mainly media. There have been conducted workshops on how this news should be conveyed in order to not create sentiments of xenophobia among people, which you do get to see some of those in social media, anecdotally, in this case. You do see, for instance, people lambasting migrants or migration, but then you immediately start seeing the other side trying to counteract that type of message, which I find a give and take fairly interesting. And again, this is anecdotally because we haven't run this through the analysis at some point within a quantitative analysis, but it seems to be the case that, well, it's not seems to be the case. There is the case where some people counteract the message of others, and while there is negative sentiments, there is also a high number of positive sentiment conveyed in social media. So I think that, I don't know if that addresses, or at least that complements what Erika was saying.
It's really interesting. Does anybody, I'm just like blah, 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 give me an open space and I'll just keep talking. Are there other questions?
You have a question?
I have a question for Joseph. I can let other people go too, but Joseph, I was wondering if there's an overarching story that connects the social media, a social network analysis of your tweets with the content of your tweets. So you provided these two, but they seem to be separate analyses. Is there a connection between the social network analysis and then the Twitter sentiment and tone?
Okay. Measurable, there is one way, and it's with the hashtags. So the hashtag is like an element that can be used to know what are the people talking about. So if they use, for example, hashtag Venezuela, we have more idea about what are we talking about. So these communities that are generated in these graphs have also these hashtags elements, and we have a better idea. Also, in general, this method, these people that are related in these communities tend to talk about the same things. They tend to talk similarly, but we cannot measure, because in this social network analysis is only an exploratory point of view. It doesn't have a text approach still.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? I'm not hearing anything.
Can I ask you a question, Michaela?
Yeah, but as the chair?
Yeah, I mean, in this world of virtual conferencing, you also chaired a bunch of sessions in IASFM, probably in this one. Have you seen any other people that are in the process of doing these types of media analyses in migration, or anything that's close to this?
I don't think so. I've seen it, and I feel like everyone I've seen it from would be people I know. And so it's the same networks. It's all the same networks of people, but more impoverished. So I'm trying to think of where I've seen network analysis around issues of migration. And yeah, and I think it's all been through the various people in those big data projects that we're both aware of. Is it,
Yeah.
is it,
Is
are
there
you seeing it?
no, but I just wondered if there's a reason, like if there's a particular culture or discipline leaning in forced migration research that keeps people away from using news as a data source.
I've seen discourse analysis of media.
Okay.
So I think I haven't seen it used the way you use it, which is, so even the analyses, the thematic analyses that you've done of the media, I think I'm framing it more in terms of how it aligns then with other big data approaches. But I've certainly seen discourse analysis of media frequently, yes.
Because
So-
the discourse analysis proves a little problematic when we're talking about doing multiple countries where we don't have native fluency, right? And so we translate these things. We can't take the word phrasing at its face value because it's, like it's being used in a different context that we may not understand. Even in South Africa, where English newspapers are a small fraction of the newspapers that are available. And so we've avoided discourse analysis in favor of, like Madison said, focusing on like events and the frequencies of reporting. And I feel like I haven't seen that.
Yeah, Christina's saying that her microphone's not working. But she also has seen a lot of discourse analysis. Eric, oh my gosh, I've seen comparisons of Germany and Canada. And Rubens has a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Michaela. It's just a brief comment and a big bravo for you guys and on these reports. I found it very inspiring. I'm a Venezuelan. I live in Argentina, and I guess that this kind of approach and study are very useful in general terms, even for us, the migrants. And given your question, Erika, I think that you are opening a tremendous field of research, because I guess the social media analysis could be used not only to study the host population, but also the migrant population. As a migrant, I can witness that we use Twitter, WhatsApp, and we have created a lot of networks, virtual networks, to share information, to really understand how it's going to be the country where we're going to, or how is the environment, even to measure the levels of xenophobia that we can face in different countries. And right now, I guess that the Venezuelan migration has one of the biggest and not explored fully virtual networks in the world. I mean, we are connected, have WhatsApp groups with people in Dubai or in Colombia, in Peru, in the US and Canada. So it's I think that you are facing an enormous challenge, but also it's going to be very productive. That's what I want to share with you guys.
Thank
you
you.
for your comment.
Annie, are you gonna ask a question?
Well, I just wanted to, I had some just general thoughts around your projects, and thank you so much. I was curious in terms of where you see this going, right? Next steps, potential other sites that each group is going to explore. And then the second piece was something that Rubens said about sort of more public versus more private, right? Network channels. So thinking about WhatsApp versus social media or newspaper, and how you see that shaping the analysis, or in your thoughts around that. So, and thank you. This has been super interesting.
Also to Ruben's point earlier, I think Katherine maybe can talk to this more, but the team has been trying to establish a relationship with an NGO, Coalition Venezuela, which would help give us a window into that, the Migrant Voice Network as well. And the WhatsApp is really complicated because it's, of course, private, and doing research via WhatsApp is a little complicated, but we have talked about trying to get contacts within WhatsApp groups so that we can distribute surveys or quick polls, but it's harder to map a WhatsApp network because it's locked. I mean, the whole idea of it is that it's encrypted, right? And so we don't have as much access to that. And our other case country that's in this project right now is South Africa, which we haven't done. We've pulled the articles, but we haven't had enough manpower, woman power, to actually get to coding those articles yet. And so one of the future things that we're working on, Jose is pushing forward right now, is using basically AI technology like IBM Watson, to be able to automatically code these articles. So essentially we'd have people like Madison and Lydia, Leah and Lise, that they would train this AI about what kinds of factors and actors, mechanisms, rules we're looking for, and then it would be able to just chunk these out. Because of course, these coding efforts, this has been over a year to code the Democritus ones, and that was a set of 450 articles. But you have to go back over, you have to redevelop these coding, code books so that everyone's using the same ones and compare them. And so the idea is that we could train Watson, and then we could start looking beyond our current case countries into emerging situations and be able to monitor these. So that's kind of our long-term vision for this, is to include, I mean, Jose is really following the Tigray situation closely. And so it would be our dream, right, to be able to not have to use 3-4 students for an entire year to code these articles, that we could do something really rapidly instead. I don't know if you want to add something.
I think that in terms of the closed platforms, we have observed research that has been done, let's say, in places like Telegram, in closed groups. We haven't followed that route, especially I think it's more along the lines of what people are saying where. In the context of Lesbos, for instance, Facebook is king. And a lot of the information is shared in private groups to which we really don't have access to. We have talked to our subject matter expert on the island to see if we might be able to distribute information in those groups. But this is something that we're planning on doing whenever we have a survey available, so it makes the capture of the data a lot easier. Instead of observing, it's more like trying to share and try to obtain their perspectives in a matter that is more, again, it's easier at least for us to be able to analyze the data. And in terms of kind of complementing what Erika said, is that in terms of future, the important aspect here, I think the big picture is displacement is going to keep on happening. What we're trying to capture here is how certain places at the local, national level react to these situations, in order to be able to see what can we say about the next one, or at least people can inform themselves about how that situation is going to be responding to the other one. So, for instance, the consideration of time is very important in the research that we have done, in order to be able to say, well, the factors, what factors are crucial? For instance, 2 factors that I always find interesting, even though those are discussed, but we're trying to find kind of the detail of where this thing failed. So in the context of Colombia, for instance, in terms of Cucuta, situation in Necoclí in the border with Panama, and the situation in the context of Greece, a lot of the situation start with this ripple effect of the lack of communication between the local government and the national government. So we ask, well, what is the lack of coordination? What does that mean at the end of the day? So we have the opportunity to talk to a person from Migration Colombia, just to confirm some of the findings that we have had on some of the interviews that we have had on some of the press conferences that have transferred. That is something that we forgot to mention, that we're also analyzing some of the press conference in the context of Colombia that the government has done along the different departments or states in the Colombian context. So one of the answers was, well, the problem was that you have a mayor's office the mayor of office does not have enough people in order to be able to interact with the national government. So even if the national government has or potentially has resources to send to the local side, there is no point of contact to be able to do this type of thing. So that's something as simple as that there is not a point of contact because the mayor office is just one person. There is nobody else to assist in this situation. That is fairly useful. The delay of the dismissal, for instance, every now and then by the national government. What we have observed in situations like the Rio Grande in the United States, Lesbos, Greece, and Necoclí in Colombia is that the national government presence, it just arrives a little bit too late. And that's not counting that when the UNHCR organization as such, they also arrive very late. I think the last number that we have from Greece is that UNHCR started arriving, I think it's about 9 months after the fact. And in Necoclí, so far in the border with Panama, IOM is helping with some, I think it's translation services. There is another institution that is providing water tanks, but ultimately UNHCR is just finding its grounding of what it can do, even though the situation has been going for months. So what I'm trying to say overall is that we definitely want to get a picture from these two places, and it's convenient in the sense that they started almost at the same time. They deal with different populations. These are two different cultures. There are two different sending, receiving communities. So in that sense, it gives us a sense of what to learn from that so we can see if we can apply it in the next place. I don't know if that addresses some of the concerns that you have.
It does, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Katherine.
Oh, I would like to add something. Jose hasn't mentioned yet is we want also about talking about the future of the research. What we are doing right now is talking with different NGOs that are led by Venezuelans or people from Colombia who lived people from Colombia who lived in Venezuela for a period of time and who had to return to Colombia. These NGOs have been providing us with the information about the decision making the migrants have to go through, and the idea also is to simulate. One of these different methods we're using is to provide data and information to the simulations in order to know different scenarios to in the future to have a better decision making about how these migrants are going through the process. I don't know if Jose wanted to extend a little bit about that.
Yes. One of the objectives, of course, is to try to put this in, as I mentioned, time, for instance. We're trying to capture the evolution of the situation through time. One of the elements that we would like to understand is, can we replicate that in a computer? Can a computer provide some of the similar dynamics that we were able to observe? And in that sense, can those dynamics be extended in the future and see how we can further understand the situation without being able to collect all this data, etc. So it's almost basically the word that we use is having this experimental in silico situation that give us a sense of how these situations evolve in order to be able to start changing some of these or tweaking these parameters according to each country, to each particular condition. So that is part of the work. This is something that has gone a little bit slowly because we're trying to go through the qualitative analysis first, and we want the qualitative analysis to inform that modeling process in the near future. So this is something that we're working slowly, but we're getting there.
Michaela, I think you're.
Yeah, I just want to give people a heads up that we have 6 minutes left. So we have time for one more question. I just wanted to give people the time warning because you get kicked out of Feed Loop with no ceremony. Are there other questions, or is there any other comment that people would like to share? You can also type in the chat if you prefer.
I mean, we're pretty excited that we just filled up 90 minutes of talking. So that feels like an accomplishment.
We're a good team. Amazing audience. Okay, then maybe rather than waiting for us to be cut off mid-sentence, I will take this moment to thank our presenters and the team and the audience for a wonderful set of presentations, really interesting research, and a great post-presentation conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Michaela.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay, and I would also just remind the presenters to sign the form for permission. Bye.